Namaskar, sir.
Namaskar, sir.
Yes. So I'm Sushil Pandit. Let's get introduced.
Yes, sir. Good morning. As part of our nation building, we have been taking causes and strengthening our own hands for a strong nation. We have taken up the cause of all those marginalized, like physically challenged, transgenders, and others. Along with this, the people at the borders of our country, the Sikhs in Punjab and the Kashmiris, especially the Pandits, have been used against to test our commitment to Sanatan Dharma. We cannot sit back as mute spectators to what is going on and see the genocide of Kashmir Pandits and others and allow the constant attack on our civilization. We, as future citizens of India, want to stand shoulder to shoulder to raise our voice for those that have been marginalized. The people cannot be refugees in their own country. We have Mr. Sushil Kumar Panditji with us today. He is a Kashmir based social activist and very good speaker. He is a former media controller in McCann Erickson, which is an US based advertisement company. In September 1999, Mr. Sushil founded the Hive Communication Private Limited in Delhi and he took responsibility as Chief Executive Officer. He welcomes the Indian government's historic discussion of Council Article of 370. We welcome you, sir.
Thank you.
I'm Mitali of Class 8B.
And
Wonderful,
I'm
Mithali.
Archit of Class 8C, sir. Okay, sir. So now Mitali and I would like to start off with asking you a few questions. So, sir, what is the present situation of the Kashmiri Pandits?
Uh, well, Kashmiri Pandits, as you know, about 31 years ago were violently expelled from the valley of Kashmir, where they lived for thousands of years as the earliest inhabitants. The place belonged to them, and they built up the place as a culture, as a civilization, as a society. And there are textual references, historical references to their existence there and to their work. Work in the field of almost all aspects of knowledge creation and knowledge dissemination. And this was going on uninterrupted till about 600 years back.
Yes, sir.
And in 1339, to be precise, Islam came to Kashmir not riding a horse and not leading an army, but seeking refuge. And this generous society accepted them as refugees, and then they wormed their way up through intrigue and deceit and through some kind of palace machinations seized the throne. And once that was done, for the next almost 500 years, there was a continuous reign of Islamic rulers, sultans, which led to complete disruption of that society, accompanied by gory violence and persecution, which led to either people forcibly converted into Islam or tortured and killed or just fleeing the place for their lives. So massive exoduses of native Hindus from Kashmir began to happen. And this continued till about 200 years back, when Maharaja Ranjit Singh liberated Kashmir from the reign of Pathans. This was 1819. And that is when a bit of respite followed, but by then a huge damage was done. We were reduced to barely double digits in proportion of population by then. From 100% population of Hindus and some of them Buddhists, we were reduced to barely 10 to 15% population of Hindus and Buddhists. And a very aggressive and violence-prone population of Islamists in Kashmir. While the rest of the country was enjoying and celebrating dawn of freedom in 1947, in the name of secularism, we were handed back to Sheikh Abdullah, a Muslim leader from Kashmir Valley. An Indian constitution, Indian parliament was denied access to Kashmir, Jammu and Kashmir, which is what led to an autocratic and discriminatory rule in Kashmir all over again. And our suffering started again. We were discriminated against, and we were deprived of our just and fair share, whether it was in education, jobs, opportunities, economic opportunities, business opportunities. And there was also a great deal of social hostility because we were a small minority. So there was a quiet and consistent drift away from Kashmir in search of education and employment. But by 1990, they weren't happy with small numbers that we were living in. So they unleashed huge amount of violence in the name of freedom struggle, targeted Hindus, killed a lot of them, raped the women, burnt homes, desecrated temples, usurped lands, and terrorized an entire population to leave again. That happened in 1990 onwards. Massive massacres also followed. Whenever the community decided to return to their village or to their place of living, in order to deter them from returning. And when I talk of 600 years ago history and this kind of violence, one can perhaps take heart in the fact that at that time India was not united. We were divided and splintered into small little kingdoms who were constantly bickering with each other. There was no constitution, there was no parliament, there were no Supreme Courts, there was no media. So we could accept it as some kind of a misfortune that had hit us. We didn't have a standing army that could defend us. But the latest exodus of 1990 happened when India was a united country. In 1990, our population was more than 900 million. We had a standing army of 1.5 million. We had our Supreme Courts and High Courts and lower courts. We had a vibrant media. We were a functional democracy. And we were not living in Middle Ages. we were living in modern era with concept of human rights, democracy, freedom, rule of law prevailing. Yet, such was the perversion of secular politics that this was allowed to happen. And 31 years down the line, there is no justice, nobody has been punished, nobody has been found guilty, no compensation has been given, and Kashmiri Hindus remain out of their lands as refugees in their own country and thrown about, literally scattered all over the country and world. So that is the current status. Still waiting for justice, still waiting for acknowledgement of what happened, still waiting for the system of the state, institutions and organs of the state to reverse their genocide. This is the current status of Kashmiri Hindus, as you had asked. Sorry for this long-winded answer, but I thought I must give you the perspective, the references to the present situation.
No, sir, thank you for that answer, sir. It's really, sad to hear that you still are not getting the justice you need. I hope the situation changes, sir. Now, Mithali would like to ask you questions.
Yes, sir. Sir, I would like to ask you, who are the big names of the Kashmiri Pandits?
You mean to ask who do we take pride in for their contribution?
Yes, sir.
If I go really far back in history, because that is where I need to start, Kashmiri society owes its origins to Rishi Kashyapa, after whom Kashmir was named. He is the one who established a thriving pluralistic society in pursuit of knowledge. And Kashmir became the abode of knowledge traditions of India. Adi Shankaracharya was born in Kerala, and since he was very, very wise and intelligent at a very young age, and he produced some very interesting works, he was called Shankaracharya and declared a child prodigy. But he decided to undertake a journey to Kashmir. Why? Because in his lifetime he had heard that Kashmir was the abode of Ma Saraswati. Because most of the knowledge traditions that prevailed in India during his time had their origin in Kashmir. And the oldest university that the world had known about, called Sharada Peeth, was in Kashmir. And he composed a shloka, a mantra, which goes like this: Namaste Ma Sharade Kashmira Puravasini Prarthaye Tvam Aham Nityam Vidya Jnanam Cha Dehima. This is salutation to Ma Saraswati, Ma Sharada, who he says is Kashmira Puravasini, whose abode is Kashmir. And he says, I pray to you, I bow to you every day. Prarthaye Tvam Aham Nityam. And why? Vidya Jnanam Cha Dehima, so that you give me the boon of knowledge and wisdom. Now this is Adi Shankaracharya paying his homage and salutations to Kashmir. And he went to Kashmir to visit Sharada Peeth, where he acquainted his peers with his knowledge, and they acknowledged him as a great philosopher and intellectual, and opened the southern gates for the first time, through which he ascended the chair, the Peetha. He became the Peethadipati. And it is there that he was declared Jagat Guru. So he began to be called Jagat Guru Adi Shankaracharya. That is the stature of Kashmir in those texts. Because people of different aspects of knowledge existed there and wrote their texts and treatises and were therefore acknowledged as the foremost intellectuals in their fields. For example, Panini. Panini wrote the grammar of Sanskrit, which is the earliest language and the earliest piece of work on grammar. He was born in Swat. Swat is a valley which is currently in Pakistan-occupied Kashmir. It is barely 100 kilometers as the crow flies from the valley of Kashmir. He composed Ashtadhyayi, which is the grammar of Sanskrit. He was from Kashmir. I'm sure you take interest in Indian classical music traditions. Indian classical music traditions are clearly in two streams. One is called Hindustani classical and another is called the Carnatic style. Both these classical music traditions based on ragas find their origin in one text, and that text is called Sangeet Ratnakar. The author of that text is Sharangadev. If you go to the first shloka in the very first chapter, Skanda in Sanskrit, where he introduces himself, he says, Asti swasti graha kula vansham Shri Mada Kashmira Sambhavam. That the family, the lineage I come from, has its origins in Kashmir, Srimad Kashmir. Likewise, Anandavardhana, who wrote Dhvanyalok, was one of the foremost knowledge creators in the field of aesthetics. His Dhvanyalok, his defining text, is about the role of sounds, phonetics, in literature, in poetry. And this makes him, even today, one of the most sought after authors and his text. He was born in Kashmir. Mammat, who wrote Kavya Prakash, again a defining text in poetics, was born in Kashmir. Ruyak, a great grammarian who wrote a treatise on Ashtadhyayi of Panini, was born in Kashmir and wrote in Kashmir. Acharya Abhinav Gupta, whose treatise on Bharat Muni's Natya Shastra, called Abhinav Bharati, is considered even more important than the original source, which is Bharat Muni's Natya Shastra, because without this, it is extremely difficult to understand or teach this text. And Natya Shastra is so important to Sanskrit literature that it is often called the fifth Veda. A lot of Sanskrit scholars call it Natya Ved, not Natya Shastra. Now, both these were created in Kashmir. Likewise, there are several more philosophers, knowledge creators, grammarians, mathematicians. For example, Patanjali. Today, India is known for yoga all over the world. And yoga is coming from a text called Yoga Sutra, which were written by Patanjali. And Patanjali was born in Kashmir. He wrote there. So when you recall the contribution of Kashmir and Kashmiris, most of the Sanskritists today are unanimous in their view that if you take out the contribution of Kashmiris to Sanskrit literature, the entire body of Sanskrit texts available today, if you take out the contribution of Kashmiris or what was written in Kashmir, then what will be left is anybody's nightmare. Such is the historic contribution of Kashmiris and Kashmir to our knowledge traditions, which is why it was called Sharada Pradesh, which is why more than 1500 years ago Adi Shankara took this arduous journey to Kashmir when there were no railways, no flights, and the fame, the good name of these philosophers, these intellectuals, spread far and wide without the internet, without the emails, and without the WhatsApp, that people traveled from all directions to seek knowledge from them and to prove their own merit, their own mettle in the place which boasted of the highest standards prevailing at that time. Be that as it may, not just from the knowledge traditions point of view, even in terms of administration, we've had some of the most amazing kings in the history that our historians have decided to completely ignore. And not just ignore, but whitewash from our textbooks. I wonder if you've heard of Lalitaditya. Have you?
No.
Lalitaditya Muktapid was a Kashmiri empire builder. The Western historians call him the Alexander of the East. Can you imagine? He was perhaps the earliest kings to unite India into a large kingdom. And his empire stretched down south to Kaveri. In the east, went up to Pragajyotish, which is today called the area of Brahmaputra, Assam. And in the west, it went up to the Caspian Sea, which is north of Iran. His capital was Kashmir. You can Google Lalitaditya. He was born in 699. He became the king in 720 at the age of 21 years. But what is most significant about his empire building is he built this territory when Islam was raging like wildfire across the world. He not only stopped them, he prevailed over them. And if you put things in context, one of the earliest rulers of Islam who came invading India and succeeded in building a foothold, came to India in 711. His name was Muhammad bin Qasim, and he had raided Sindh, which is today in Pakistan, the area near Karachi. He came via sea, and he defeated the Indian king by deceit called Dahir, Raja Dahir. Lalitaditya at that time was barely 12 years old. And when you see that despite entering Indian territory in one corner, it took Islam more than 500 years to reach Delhi. Delhi fell in 1192, whereas he had come in 711. Now imagine what kind of resistance and struggle happened in the intervening 5 centuries. Lalitaditya was one of the earliest resistance to Islam in India. It was followed by another great king from another great dynasty called Bappa Rawal of Sisodia dynasty, who established the empire of Mewar. Lalitaditya came from the dynasty called Karakota. So we had some of the most amazing kings and empire builders from Kashmir. Kanishka from the Kushan dynasty also ruled from Kashmir, and they were one of the best sculptors and town builders. So from literature, art, philosophy, aesthetics, to even administration and politics, Kashmir had a significant contribution. If you look at astronomy, if you look at medicine, health, if you look at sciences, grammar, you will find in each one of these areas of specialization, Kashmiris had had a significant contribution to make.
I'd like to mention is that I study Sanskrit. I'm a Sanskrit student at Kenchri School. So our sir, our Sanskrit guru, he mentioned about Panini, and we know the story of him. We learned it when we was in 6th. So as you mentioned about that, plus all those other facts that you gave, they were really interesting and very knowledgeable, sir. I'm sure me and Archit, those points,
Yes, sir.
some things about India that we don't know, being Indians ourselves, we are known to it now. So thank you.
Yes, sir.
You're most welcome. And it's very rewarding to be with you and be talking to you, and a great opportunity to interact with you and know more about what you pursue and what you like to pursue. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir. I think Archit would ask the next question to you.
Please go ahead.
Yes, thank you, Mitali. So, sir, can you please tell us how to resettle the Kashmiris and how they will get their money back and their property back? So, can you please tell us how they will do all of that?
You see, wonderful question, because I think you honed in straight to the challenge we face today. But our misfortune is that we are very often unwilling to acknowledge the facts as we see them. And this burden generally is carried by those who find this too inconvenient to admit. So first and foremost, before we even start addressing what is the solution to the problem we face, like a good doctor, we must first diagnose what the problem is. Now, it is easy to diagnose once you acknowledge the problem honestly. But if you are unwilling to acknowledge the problem honestly, then you have gone wrong on the very first step. Then there is no redemption. There is no correction possible. We need to very clearly acknowledge today that we face a challenge from doctrinaire Islam, from hardcore, unrelenting, intolerant strain of belief. And what is that belief? The belief is there is only one truth, there is only one God, there is only one religion. And no other religion, no other God, no other perspective has any legitimate right to exist. So long as you do not question this premise, so long as you do not reject this totalitarian view, there is no solution possible, because it is a supremacist idea which says that only one thought, only one God, only one religion, only one culture, only one language, and only one lifestyle has a right to exist, and rest all must be destroyed. And therefore, we must first and foremost acknowledge that today we are faced with a challenge that seeks to eliminate plurality. Do you understand? So this is when we will be able to accept one truth. Second, very often in the name of tolerance, we tolerate even intolerance. There cannot be any equation between tolerance and intolerance. Your tolerance should be intolerant of intolerance. Because the moment you cede ground, the moment you accommodate intolerance, then it is out to gobble you up. Okay? It will be a great travesty, it will be a great hypocrisy if in the name of plurality you destroy plurality. And we use secularism as a word to sanctify space for everyone, even those who are inimical to the rest of us. And hence we must acknowledge the fact that what we face in Kashmir is jihad. Jihad is the manifestation, is the war unleashed by an intolerant ideology on those who do not agree with them. But if in the name of secularism, if you go out and accommodate jihad, if you go out and give concessions to jihad, if you go out and pay a ransom to jihad in order to buy peace, there will be no peace. So we need to first and foremost define the problem, define the challenge honestly, and not based on political considerations, based on expedience, based on short-term gains, based on political loss or profit, electoral considerations, vote bank politics, because all this leads to misdiagnosis. And if you misdiagnose, you will never be able to start treating. But the other issue is, even when you diagnose it right, you don't have the courage to administer the right solution, because you think it's too messy, because you think that it will rob you of your status quo, peace, stability, because you have exaggerated fears of what this right solution might do, because it will upset too many. So if there is a cancer which is growing under your skin and has created some kind of a tumor, you cannot use Iodex. If surgery is needed, then surgery, so be it. So diagnosis and then honest solution, honest approach to fight it. And finally, commitment to your obligations as a state, as a constitution, as a nation. We have an obligation to uphold human rights. We have an obligation to deliver justice. We have an obligation to protect our citizens. How can we let an entire community of law-abiding citizens rot away in refugee camps for more than 3 decades without justice, without protection, without any compensation? But that is what is happening. So all of it is extremely necessary. Recent incidents in America brought about a slogan called Black Lives Matter. "31 years ago, what happened and wasn't addressed for more than 3 decades somehow tells us that Kashmiri Hindu lives do not matter. Just don't matter, because they aren't enough in number to inflict an electoral defeat or to help a party come to power through their votes. So in our competitive democracy, just because they cannot defeat someone or make someone win, doesn't mean that they don't matter. But that is what has come to pass, because we believe as law-abiding citizens who did not take to gun, who did not take to violence, who did not take to blocking highways, who did not take to disrupting normal life, had nobody caring for them, had nobody addressing their issues, because they don't matter. So every life matters, every crime matters, every violation matters, is what we need to uphold, because today jihad is going for this low-hanging fruit called Kashmiri Hindus who do not matter. Tomorrow they will come after people in rest of India, which they already do in more than 500 clusters across the country, where there is no 370. Hindus are forced to leave their homes, go to some safer places. And gradually, this kind of exodus is beginning to take place. You are sitting in Bangalore. Not too far away from Bangalore is a place called Bhatkal. It is a coastal town where Hindus are now less than 3%, and that too at the periphery of the town. And the place produces some of the most dreaded terrorists. Yasin Bhatkal, if you have heard the name, and if you know, and if you don't, you could Google who Yasin Bhatkal was. You would know what kind of terror he unleashed. And this is what brings me to one important point here: stabilizing our demography. What is demography? Demography is a balance of population. What jihad seeks to do is to upset this balance by kicking out Hindus. And once they achieve that, the area becomes a no-go area even for police because they are scared for their lives. So such clusters, when they fester, first they ensure that the Hindu population there dwindles to insignificant levels. This gives them the cover to carry out all the nefarious criminal activities over which there is no oversight of a community who are patriotic and who would not allow such things in ordinary circumstances. And then these zones become the staging points for anti-national activities. Just as Bhatkal has become in Karnataka, or Malappuram has become in Kerala, or Osmanabad, Sikandrabad, Hyderabad have become in Telangana. Ramanathapuram or Ambur have become in Tamil Nadu. A place like Bhadrak or Balasore have become in Orissa. Kishanganj, Araria, Khagaria have become in Bihar. Murshidabad,
Sushilji,
Malda have become in West Bengal. Yes.
Sushilji, we don't
Sir.
even have to go that far. Within the city of Bangalore, we had a fire riot.
Absolutely,
place, yes?
absolutely.
So they don't have to look far. It's right out here.
Right in the city, a
City.
capital city of Bangalore, which raged into a riot because there were clusters where even police could not enter.
They enter.
And
And
they
they burn
burned
police station.
hundreds of vehicles. So this is the price you pay when you ignore for the sake of convenience and expedience. You allow such geographies to crop up where there is no oversight because the population balance has been completely upset. And Hindus who are the original inhabitants, who owe their umbilical links to Indian civilization and culture, and who are committed to preserving it, dwindle in numbers. And that is what they have achieved in Kashmir Valley today, where Hindus have been cleansed out. And which is why we lose our brothers, our sons, every day defending India. Our armed forces, our police jawans, our paramilitary forces, and our ordinary citizens every day pay with their lives, with their blood spilt in Kashmir. Because we not only allowed an entire demography to be ruined, that balance to be thrown out, we have not been able to restore that balance in the last 31 years because there hasn't been the political resoluteness, political will for that balance to be restored. And we are paying a price every day. So this is a lesson from Kashmir. It may have started in Kashmir, but it will not end there. You will have hundreds of Kashmirs cropping up all over the country. You know, I know some of you may like McDonald's burgers. McDonaldization of a problem is when the small franchisees open at every street corner. Right? The burger revolution started in US, but today it has spread all over the country. It becomes a template. It becomes a model which is scalable. So once they have achieved the success in Kashmir, they will be tempted, and they are tempted, and they are replicating it all over. So Kashmir franchisees, like McDonald franchisees, will open in your neighborhood tomorrow if you don't address it. That is the message from Kashmir to rest of India, that beware and be prepared, or else there'll be hell to pay.
Yes, sir.
Sorry again for a
Yes,
very
sir.
long-winded answer.
Oh,
No, sir, that was really helpful because even, the comparison you made, the metaphor you took as the doctor and the diagnosis of a cancer, it really helped me understand better, didn't it? Mitali,
Yes,
did it
sir.
help you too?
It's true. It's
Yes,
true,
sir.
Archit.
So thank you, sir. Mitali would like to ask you one more question.
Yes, sir. So the question I would like to ask you is there longing to return back home still present? I have read about townships that have actually settled a few thousand pundits. So does that bring any relief to you?
Thank you so much for asking a wonderful question, which today is engaging the entire community. Mitali, as I mentioned, paperwork solutions, patchwork solutions, symbolic solutions are no solutions. Iodex is no solution to a cancerous tumor. Likewise, when I say that there is no justice for the victims and survivors of what happened in 1990, 31 years ago, when there is not even an acknowledgement of what happened to us. The word used for us is migrants. Migrants are those who move from one place to the other looking for economic or other opportunities, and they travel on their own will. There couldn't have been a worse travesty when we were called migrants while we were the victims of a genocide. So Indian state, Indian government, Indian system is unwilling to even acknowledge what happened to us, and they treat us like flood victims or earthquake victims or victims of a pandemic and displaced because of reasons other than a genocide. So when you wish to get this monkey off your back, because people always accuse you of not doing enough, so what you do is you throw some money, pick up a piece of land, build some houses there, and push us back into Kashmir. Is no solution. We already had our homes, we had our jobs, we had a life in Kashmir. We did not move out for the lack of our homes or jobs. We moved out because there was a threat to our life, collective life. Massacres preceded our exodus. And when people responsible for those massacres are not just living and roaming around, but are thriving, have become tycoons, have become social icons in Kashmir, with what face do you expect us to go there and live again as if nothing happened? Among our tormentors, among our killers. So we have insisted on a sequence of events for us to go. First, acknowledge what happened. Acknowledge the genocide. Even if it is embarrassing, even if it is shameful for you to accept, but you cannot push it under the carpet. First things first, acknowledge what happened to us in 1990, which means the correct diagnosis. 2, deliver justice to the victims and survivors. You cannot ignore it. You cannot run away from it. And we cannot be expected to go and live among our murderers without they facing the consequences of what they did to us. Can you imagine a victim living with the perpetrator all over again as if nothing happened?
Not at all, sir.
So, first acknowledge what happened. Why were we pushed out? How, in what circumstances were we chased out? Two, deliver justice and make those people face the consequences of their crime, heinous crimes. Three, whenever we say that such a crime took place, a lot of people from Kashmir say, but we didn't do it. There were some other people who did it. They carried the guns, they carried the bombs, and they carried out those crimes. Well, they could be true technically, that not everyone was carrying a gun and not everyone was going about killing and murdering and raping people. But there is a large number of those who profited from our exodus. When we were chased out, our homes were taken over, our shops and businesses were taken over, our jobs were taken over, our temple lands, even our cremation grounds were not spared. So a large number of people have profited from our exodus. They are sitting on our properties, they are sitting on our wealth, they are sitting on our assets. They vandalized our temples. They desecrated our pilgrimages. That didn't need a gun. That didn't need a murder. And this was widespread. And they are still sitting on those ill-gotten gains. Unless this is taken away from them, there will remain an incentive to commit another genocide another time. This is stolen property. So what we are saying is, please divest such profiteers of our genocide from our property. Restore it to us. Take it away from them. Because a generation or two down the line, they will again be tempted, if we are back, to again rob us by committing another genocide. Because it becomes a very lucrative proposition, isn't it, Mithali? So this is the third thing we say in the sequence. And fourth, what we are saying is, we cannot live amongst them anymore. We need a secure enclave for ourselves where we will rebuild our society. We cannot go back in the same neighborhoods and be like sitting ducks as a minuscule minority surrounded by an aggressive majority, a hostile majority, and cowering and fearing their attacks and living as hostages among them. So you cannot spread us thin into small little colonies here and there. Don't divide us. Don't scatter us. You give us one consolidated enclave where we will go, where we will run our affairs ourselves, our schools, our hospitals, our bazaars, our police stations, and including our safety, our security. We need a Panun Kashmir. Panun means our. We need our own Kashmir in the valley. We will not go back to be slaughtered again and to run away again. So these are the 4 points we have very clearly stated. But unfortunately, our government doesn't engage with us, doesn't listen to us, and they know this is a hanging burden on their head, that we are still out. It embarrasses them. So they want to get rid of this by some symbolic, some token construction of homes here and there and push us back. And then advertise the fact that we have done our job. So don't blame us anymore. This kind of solution is worse than the problem itself. because this pushes us into a repeat of what we faced 31 years ago. And we are not going to jeopardize the lives of our women and children, our old parents, and our future generation to the same risks, to the same horrendous experiences that we faced 31 years ago. It has to be a comprehensive solution. It cannot be a tokenist, symbolic gesture just to absolve yourself of all responsibility as a state, as a government, towards its citizens. I hope I have been able to answer your question, Mitali.
Yes, sir. Yes. And so you have the whole right to demand for justice, sir, because whatever you just mentioned, I completely agree with your point as well.
Thank you.
Sir, has this been taken to the Supreme Court? This issue?
Yes, yes, Mitali, in June of 2017, when nothing was being done, we approached the Supreme Court. At that time, the Chief Justice was Justice J.S. Kehar. He heard our matter at the admission stage with another judge who is still serving, Justice Chandrachud. Justice Kehar has retired since. So Justice Kehar, the then Chief Justice, and Justice Chandrachud, the division bench, sat on our application for redressal. This was a petition we filed. And they refused to admit this petition. First, they asked us, have you come here for publicity? We told the Chief Justice, we are no film stars or politicians who have to win elections. We are ordinary citizens. We are faceless, nameless people who perhaps their neighbors also do not know enough about. So what do we do with publicity? We are ordinary citizens going about our lives seeking justice. The second question they asked was, where were you for 27 years? We said, what did we have to do? There are hundreds and thousands of FIRs pending. You have to investigate. You have to prosecute. You have to deliver justice. What is our role except for witnesses? And we are willing whenever we are called. To this, then justices said, but it is now 27 years. Who will investigate? Who will find the evidence? What will happen? And therefore, there's no need for this petition to be heard. They threw us out. Mind you, within 2 months, they admitted another petition which said that when Gandhi was murdered, not 2 but 4 bullets were fired. The other 2 bullets that were attributed to Godse were accounted for, but the rest of the bullets were not. So therefore, let us figure out who were the other assassin, if at all there was another assassin. And they admitted the case. Imagine 70 years after Gandhi murder, they admitted that case in Supreme Court. At that time, lack of evidence and lack of witnesses and so much time didn't bother them. But in our case, 27 years was too long now to deliver justice or to investigate or prosecute. Even as our case was heard, they knew that cases of Sikh massacre of 84 were still going on, which preceded our exodus. And more than that, Mitali, let me inform you and through you, the other students of the school and the faculty, there is a country in our neighborhood called Bangladesh. And Bangladesh got its liberation through a brutal, violent freedom struggle of 1971, when Pakistan Army unleashed a genocide on Bengalis, specifically Hindu Bengalis, but even Muslim Bengalis who were opposed to the rule of Pakistan. You know, Bangladesh is hanging those collaborators and genociders today as we talk, convicting them of their crimes, the crimes that took place 50 years ago. Is Bangladesh a superior democracy than India? Is their criminal justice system better than ours? Do we concede? When a country like Bangladesh can punish crimes against humanity, genocidal crimes, why are we running away from it? Because our political class, because the elite that runs the country is fighting shy of diagnosing this problem and addressing it the way it must be. It doesn't want to admit, it lives in denial. So even when we approached Supreme Court, which is supposed to be the last door we can knock at for justice, they didn't mind slamming that door shut on our faces. We were told that wait for another Chief Justice to come. His name is Deepak Mishra. He succeeded J.S. Kehar, and file a review petition. So we filed a review petition after Justice Kehar retired. And this time it was the bench of Justice Deepak Mishra, the then Chief Justice. It happened in December 2017. And again, Justice Chandrachud teamed up with him in a division bench. The result was unfortunately the same. So it is not for want of knocking at the doors of Supreme Court, which opens at 2 a.m. sometimes to help terrorists like Yaqub Memon or Afzal Guru. But it wouldn't even care to admit our petition and debate over it when it involves an entire community of 500,000 Kashmiri Hindus, not just one life, and thousands of murders and rapes that happen. So we live in such times of hypocrisy, of perversion, if you may, of law, of justice, of constitutional rights, of institutions itself as high as Supreme Court. I tell you, these two Chief Justices are guilty of besmirching the reputation of our criminal justice system and destroying our institutions in their tenure. They should be shamed at every conceivable opportunity, named for it and shamed for it. And I leave no occasion, no opportunity to share this with people who are willing to hear, that these two gentlemen who headed a venerable institution called Supreme Court committed this sin in their tenure. So that was again a long answer to a short question about Supreme Court.
That's fine, sir. And sir, justice delayed is actually justice denied, sir. So
truly, truly. And in this case, this adage is 100% true.
True. Yes, sir. Archit, you can go ahead and ask the next question.
Yes, Archit.
Yes, so thank you, Mithali. So, sir, how do we as students of India make sure that we remain tuned to your cause?
Thank you so much, first of all, for your interest in this. And in a democracy, an ordinary citizen has not only a lot of rights and freedoms, but also these obligations, because these are very precious freedoms, very hard-won freedoms. We've been through an entire millennium of strife, of pain, of subjugation. Our ancestors have been through a lot of pain and torment. If you want to see any evidence, very close to Bangalore is a place called Hampi. You will be proud of what your ancestors built in terms of a civilization and culture, and what kind of a ruin it has been laid to by those who invaded and ruled over us, colonized us, and tormented us for several hundred years. So these freedoms are extremely precious, and to continue enjoying them and pass it on to our next generation, which is our obligation to them. As we receive these freedoms from our ancestors, it is an obligation to us that we pass them on not only intact, but by enriching them through our own contribution. That is how we grow collectively as a society. So we must first arm ourselves with information, with knowledge, with the right perspective, and disseminate that, share that concern, share that knowledge, share that commitment to preservation, share that obligation to work collectively for fighting back, because the threats to our freedoms and our life as we know it have only grown in the recent past. If in independent India, strong India, democratic India, with almost 800 MPs and a chosen powerful prime minister, 500,000 Kashmiri Hindus are still rotting in the camps, those threats have not receded, they have only grown. So you need to make fellow citizens aware of it, aware of the urgency to address it, and prepare yourself in terms of career and future ahead to continue contributing towards it as lawyers, as journalists, as bureaucrats, as politicians, whatever walk of life you choose for yourself. It should be anchored in not just personal glory and success, but our collective survival as a society, as a culture, as a nation, as a civilization, to ensure its continuity. Only then we would acquit ourselves honorably as the proud citizens of this country. That's how I feel, Archit. I'm sure there are other ways too.
Thank you, sir. So, Mitali, you can ask sir the next question.
Yes, sir. Just a second. I hope you are not taking much of your time.
No, I'm happy and I'm enjoying this interaction. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir. So the next question which I would like to ask is that, what is the connection of King Aditya? Is it from Suryavanshi or Chandravanshi, sir?
You know, he was Lalita Aditya. Okay. Now, Aditya is another name for sun. They were sun worshippers. So they were Suryavanshis, if you may. And they built great temples to sun god. In Martand in Kashmir, if you Google, you can see the ruins of Martand Sun Temple that was built by Lalitaditya during his reign. But Kashmir has been, as I said, an abode to various philosophical and knowledge traditions. Shaivites abound there, but Vaishnavites also in very large numbers. Devi Upasana, which is Shakti, also prevails extensively. Ganapati is worshipped, sun is worshipped. So all the Shanamata are prevalent. Kartikeyan is not as prevalent as the other five faiths. Though kings kept changing from time to time, during the Mahabharata period, we had Chandravanshi rulers. Gonanda and Damodara were Yadava kings. And Sri Krishna himself had gone to Kashmir and anointed a lady king called Yashomati. And she was arguably the first woman ruler anywhere in the world. And coronated by Prabhu Sri Krishna himself in Kashmir. And this reference is in Nilmat Puran, which is the Sthala Puran of Kashmir. Likewise, I must share with you, there was another glorious king in Kashmir who defeated Mahmud Ghaznavi. Mahmud Ghaznavi was supposed to have invaded India 12.5 times. He also vandalized Somnath and various other temples. He was one of the most feared invaders about 1,000 years ago. But it was the king of Kashmir called Sangram Raj at that time who defeated him twice. Our history again obliterates this fact because our history writers, unfortunately, are obsessed with telling us the tales of our defeat, of our torment. They want to vest us with, I don't know why, a sense of guilt and humiliation and no sense of pride and glory about our ancestors and about our past. So kings like Sangram Raj, kings like Suhel Dev Pasi, kings like Lalitaditya Muktapid, kings like Avanti Varmana, kings like Trilochan Pal are omitted. Kings like Bappa Rawal, in whose name Rawalpindi exists in Pakistan. Rawalpindi in Pakistan is named after a Hindu king who established the dynasty of Mewar, the Sisodia king called Bappa Rawal. It was Bappa Rawal's ancestor, Rana Kumbha, Rana Sangha, and finally Maharana Pratap, who resisted and defeated enemies of India. But they are not even in the footnotes of Indian history anywhere. And the kingdom of Mewar existed for 800 years. Mughals did not exist beyond 300. But Mughals dominate our history. Sisodia kings do not. Lalitaditya does not. Suhel Dev Pasi does not. And let me tell you, even Jhansi ki Rani Lakshmi Bai would not have, because you do not know about her in history as much as you know about her through a poem of Subhadra Kumari Chauhan in your Hindi textbooks, Khoob Ladi Mardani, wo to Jhansi wali Rani thi. You know, only because of Subhadra Kumari Chauhan's poem that we remember Jhansi ki Rani Lakshmi Bai, no thanks to historians. So our history is unfortunately terribly doctored and distorted. 70 years of our politics and academia hasn't done justice to what we teach you in your classrooms, in your textbooks. And Shirish ji is making a yeoman's effort to correct that by starting his own school, by correcting his own textbooks, by getting his own students to interact with alternative views so that they are equipped with this information and knowledge. And I really salute his effort. It takes a lifetime to do that.
I'll speak to him later. Tell him I'll speak to him later.
Siri sir says that he'll speak to you later, sir.
Thank you.
I'm
Yeah.
here though.
He's here.
In fact,
Archit, you can ask the next one.
Sure, thank you, Mitali. So, sir, like countries like Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Afghanistan, how did they
So
get
why
their
are
name?
they Stan? Yes.
Exactly, yes, sir, that was my
Yeah,
question.
I'll answer this question. You know, most of the languages in this region have their origin in Sanskrit. Today you find remnants of old temples and civilization of a Sanskritic civilization even found in Syria. The temples of Yazidis, the iconography there, you know, peacock is not found there, but in their temples you have peacocks, you have lotuses. It shows the extent to which Indian culture, Indian civilization, Indian art, Indian architecture went about. And as I mentioned, Lalitaditya's empire stretched up to Caspian Sea, which is north of Iran. And on the northern edge of Caspian Sea is Uzbekistan, are the Central Asian republics of Kazakhstan, of Azerbaijan, of Tajikistan, of Turkmenistan, even Pakistan or Afghanistan. So Stan is a distortion of Sthan. Now Afghanistan, the original name is Upaganistan. What are Upaganas? Like Ganas are the citizens. Upaganas are those who live at the periphery. Earlier, we used to have civilizations. Civilizations did not have finely and sharply defined borders. They had natural boundaries. Nation states began to have sharply defined borders, and nation states is a phenomenon barely 300-400 years old. It is a phenomenon of Europe. We had civilizational states, and civilizational states had a vignette of merging into the other civilizations. So we were abutting the Persian civilization, and Afghanistan was an overlapping zone. And Persian civilization also was greatly influenced by Indian civilization. They had fire worshippers called Zoroastrians. And Indian civilization also had an entire sect of people called Agnihotras. We were also fire worshippers. In fact, our texts say that the presiding deity of, presiding element of earth is fire. In some other opportunity, because I'll be digressing today, I'll explain as to how fire is the presiding deity of earth. So fire worshippers of Persia, who are called Parsis today, Parsis in India are from Persia. And they had to run away from Persia because Islam chased them out 1400 years ago. Like Kashmiri Hindus were chased out from Kashmir 31 years ago. Zoroastrians of Persia were chased out and they took refuge in India. And it is their descendants who we call Parsis. Ratan Tata is a Parsi. Adi Godrej is a Parsi. The owner of Serum Institutes, Adar Poonawalla, is a Parsi who's created a vaccine for you. These Parsis took refuge in India because they faced the same fate as we Kashmiris did 31 years ago. So, but the region between Persia and India was Afghanistan. The original name is Upaganistan, the area which abuts the other region and is an overlapping zone, and who live there are the people on the margins of civilization. So Sthan, like Gandhar, is part of Mahabharata. Today it is Kandahar in the same place called Afghanistan. Gandhari came from Gandhar. Kaikai came from a region which is today in Pakistan. My own Gotra Guru, his name is Rishi Angiras, who is my Rishi from my Gotra. My Gotra is Upamanyu, came from the regions near Caspian Sea. So this region was cradle of Sanskrit. As I said, Swat, which is today in Pakistan, is where Panini was born. So it shouldn't surprise you that Sthan got distorted as Stan and remained in the language, in the colloquial context of these places. Baramulla, for example, in Kashmir, the original name is Varahamula. Likewise, Bij Bihara in southern Kashmir is Vijayeshwar Vihara. As I said, Rawalpindi is named after Bappa Rawal. Now, who knows and who cares to tell this? Multan is the Moola Sthan. Multan is in Pakistan. Panjal was Panchal. Unfortunately, okay, there is a town north of Jammu Kashmir called Kashghar. Kashghar is today in China, in the Xinjiang province. Okay, if you look at the reign of King Kanishka, who ruled from Kashmir, Kushan Vansh, you will find Kashghar as part of his territory. And why it was called Kashghar? Because it was northern Kashi. It was a seat of learning Sanskrit. And hence, Kashghar. And in Kashghar was born a great Sanskritist, another Kashmiri, who took the message of Buddhism from Kashmir to Tibet, to Central Asia, to China, to Korea and Japan. People like Padmasambhava, who was called the second Buddha, was a Kashmiri. And the person who took this message I was talking about, his name was Kumarajiva. He was born in Kashghar. And just about 2000 years back. So our civilization and its influence was much, much larger than what you see today. And what you see today is the result of 1000 years of contraction, 1000 years of torment, of killing, of running away, of reduction, of chipping away of this civilization. So our borders getting squeezed, our people, our demography getting squeezed under relentless invasions. So that explains why Sthan in these names.
Is
Oh, okay,
yes,
okay.
sir.
Thank you, sir. Yes, sir.
Thank you, sir. That was really fascinating to hear.
Yes, sir.
Moral dilemma. Uh, how do we deal with violence? Though we are committed to non-violence. And when we are committed to non-violence and we are faced with violence, what do we do? Our non-violence has a context. And that context is that we will not resort to wanton violence. We will not resort to violence as the first resort. We will not use force, physical force, and lethal force to settle disputes. We are committed to reason. We are committed to fairness. We are committed to dharma. Dharma? Dharma is a word that defies translation in any other language because conceptually it is rooted in Indian thinking, Indian ethos. So dharma is what is right, what is honorable, what is desirable, what is fair and just, and what is the duty, what is an obligation. That is dharma. So while non-violence can be part of dharma because we can't be angry, the 10 lakshanas of dharma, one of them is akrodha, when you can't be angry. And violence very often is rooted in anger. But to uphold dharma, to uphold the right to be not angry, you have to, if you must, use violence. Which is why all our gods have a weapon in their hand. All our gods, not one is without a weapon. And that weapon is to punish adharma. And what is adharma? Adharma is when you torment the weaker. When do you use force? You use force in order to subjugate someone who cannot use as much force. You use force to prevail over the weak and to snatch away his fair right, his just right. When someone who's lesser in number, lesser in power, lesser in resources, you try and settle it with force. How do you deal with such a situation? With a counter force. Persuasion, yes, you can try. Reason, yes, you can try. But if a person was given to persuasion and reason, he would not use force on the weak. So dharma is to protect the weak and is to protect from those who use force against the weak, who use force to get their way, unjust way, unfair way, unreasonable way. And there, dharma not only mandates use of force, it makes it an obligation. Our Bhagavad Gita tells us this. When Arjuna did not want to use force, Lord Krishna told him, it is your obligation, there is no running away from it. It is not a matter of choice. When unjust and unfair resorts to force, you've got to combat it and resist it with larger, bigger force. Or you will be failing in your dharma. So there is nothing absolute about non-violence. It is preferable, it is honorable, but when it doesn't settle the matter, when to uphold the right and uphold the right of the weak to live and have justice is necessary, then violence is an obligation. But violence without anger, violence with this understanding that you are doing it for a specific purpose, not for vengeance, not for personal glory, not for profit, not for advantage, only to help the weak and to deliver justice. So violence minus anger, with a calm mind, with a resolute mind, with a very clear distinction as to what is the purpose of this. Only then you will be able to prevail, because anger paralyzes your thinking faculties. And when you are in a contest, one thing you need the most are your thinking faculties. And this doesn't come by itself. You need to practice it, you need to learn it, you need to prepare for it, you need to tame your mind for it. So you need to do it as a duty, as an obligation, and not as some kind of a tool for narrow, personal, petty advantage. You need to do it for a higher purpose. I hope I have been able to explain this in a manner. Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity. You made my day, sir.
Thank
And
you.
I look forward to visiting your school once
Please,
again
please.
and meeting all of them in person.